to clear those hormones out once the correction has been made. Okay, so the endocrine system is slow, widespread, and lasts longer, whereas the nervous system, when it corrects for a deficiency, it's instantaneous, very specific, and very short lived. Okay, so two critical differences. All right, so the endocrine system, like I said, here's your first underlined content. That, again, remember for the exams, everything underlined is 100% on your exam. These slides, my presentation slides, are going to be your best friend for studying for your exams and lecture. Okay, know that the endocrine system influences, again, cellular activity, metabolic activity, via hormones, which are transported in blood. Okay, so pretty easy, right, to see what that question is going to look like. All right, and the study of endocrinology, the medical specialty of endocrinology, is, for the most part, most endocrinologists, the bulk of their time is spent with diabetes management, because the pancreas, as we're about to talk about, is one of the endocrine organs, and it regulates blood sugar level, blood glucose, through the release of either glucagon or insulin. So a lot of endocrinology is focused on working with people with diabetes and insulin insufficiency. However, as a field, in actuality, it's more than that. It's actually the study of all the endocrine organs and the study of the hormones that they release. All right, and then here's a simple table, and you're going to see in my presentations throughout the semester that I've often embedded tables like this, and these are here really for your benefit, for when you're studying for the exams. If you have some vagueness, again, this is just a very simple, well laid out table that compares the nervous system to the endocrine system, all the things that we just talked about, and for simplicity and a refresher as you study. All right, so the endocrine system organs. And again, like I shared, in lab, we'll be covering much more of the anatomic parts of an organ system, the various organs. And in lecture, we'll be covering more of the physiology. How do those organs work together to achieve something? But there is overlap of the organs as well over here in the lecture side of things. Okay, so let's start and just talk a little bit about the various endocrine organs. We'll go from superior to inferior, again taking you back to Bio 210, looking at that midbrain area. Okay, we have the pineal gland, that little pea-sized gland that sits at the posterior of the midbrain, responsible for releasing the hormone melatonin. Okay, and melatonin is that hormone that regulates our sleep cycle, our circadian rhythm. It's what makes us sleepy when the sun sets, and makes us wide awake when the sunlight hits our eyes. Okay, it's an endocrine organ. Okay, beyond that, in the midbrain area, two major players that we're going to spend a lot of time in our next lecture, next week, Tuesday, talking about are going to be the hypothalamus and the pituitary. And the hypothalamus is called the master gland of the endocrine system, because not only does it release hormones, it also releases signaling hormones that signal other endocrine organs to release their hormones. Okay, many times, as you'll learn, the endocrine system and organs will send a hormone to another endocrine gland to trigger it to release its hormones, like a chain reaction. Okay, and the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are two of those major signaling organs of the endocrine system that can turn on or activate or turn off and deactivate other endocrine organs releasing their hormones. Okay, so hypothalamus, pituitary, you're going to hear a lot about those on Tuesday. As we descend inferiorly, we have the thyroid gland, and that lies, it's a butterfly-shaped organ, endocrine organ that lies right over the trachea in the throat area. And on the thyroid gland, we have embedded in it are these little button-like glands that are called parathyroid glands, okay? So they're all connected. And the thyroid gland, usually what we think about when we think about thyroid function is metabolism, right? People who have a deficient thyroid or a thyroid that has disease that has affected it, for example, thyroid cancer, for just one example, and diminished hormone production tend to have much slower metabolism. So they tend to put on a lot of weight. You'll hear sometimes that very obese people have an inactive or deficient thyroid, right? A thyroid deficiency. The parathyroid glands, as we'll talk about more in the coming lecture on Tuesday, are really responsible for the most part releasing calcium, the hormone, because calcium is a vital hormone circulating through the body for muscular contraction, for nervous system stimuli, for bone building and development, etc. As we continue inferiorly, we have a really unique endocrine organ here called the thymus gland. And that's sitting right in that mediastinal area of the thoracic cavity, right over the heart, again, over the trachea, just superior to the heart, sits the thymus gland. And what makes it very, very unique is that the thymus gland is very active in early childhood and even the beginning of puberty. And by the end of puberty, by somewhere, again, these are all generalized times because everyone's a little bit different. But certainly by the time a person is 20, this thymus gland has atrophied. That means it has eaten itself up and has disappeared. So most of us, if not all of us, no longer have a thymus gland, okay? And the reason for that is its function. The thymus gland helps our leukocytes, some of our leukocytes, our white blood cells, those defenders, to mature and experience different pathogens and toxins, viruses, bacteria that we're going to be exposed to during our lifetime. So our body has a natural clock in it that by the time, again, we hit near the end of puberty, typically, our body has surmised that we've encountered pretty much all of these threats that we're going to, and that no longer needs to occur. And so the thymus gland then goes away, it atrophies. Continuing as we go downward, now we have the adrenal glands, and these are triangular, as you can see, endocrine glands that sit on top of each of the kidneys. And the adrenal glands are separated, each one of them, into two different components. Much like the brain, the adrenal glands have a cortex. So they have a narrow triangular band that goes around the outer aspects of the adrenal glands. And then within that, in the middle, they have a medulla. So a cortex and a medulla for the adrenal glands. And the cortex versus the medulla produce very different hormones and different responses. Okay, the medulla works in concert. This is one illustration of where the nervous system helps stimulate hormone release. The medulla with the nervous system work to release the hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay, those are our fight or flight hormones, our panic hormones. Okay, people who have panic attacks or panic disorder, anxiety disorder, their adrenal medulla is releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine in unwarranted circumstances. When they're just sitting reading a book, they have a rush of this hormone, which creates a panic, a fight or flight response. For most of us that don't have a panic disorder, that epinephrine and norepinephrine are only released in times of sheer stress. Okay, you're driving down I-20 through Malfunction Junction, and a tractor trailer slides sideways in front of you at 65 miles an hour, right? The nervous system is going to stimulate the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine, norepinephrine. And like I said about nervous system hormones, they're instantaneous. Within a millisecond, our heart rate has sped up, our breathing has gotten deeper, Our pupils begin to dilate. Our muscles in our hands are going to tighten and clench, right? We may say some expletives, okay? There's a big response that comes from this fight or flight from the release of these hormones, epinephrine, norepinephrine. So they're from the medulla. And by the way, in anatomy, just like in law, there is a lot of overlap as far as terminology goes. And that's because way back in the ancient days, when law and human anatomy and medicine were first launched back in ancient Rome and ancient Greece, people spoke Latin. So that's why there's a lot of overlap still embedded within medical terminology. Okay, and medulla, for example, means middle in Latin. All right, so and then the cortex, that surrounding band around the adrenal glands, that actually is responsible for releasing most of our steroid type hormones. All right, so then we descend and we have the pancreas. And the pancreas is kind of unique, like the gonads underneath them, that both of these next two endocrine organs have dual functions. They actually are a part of and a functional part of two different body systems. The pancreas is part of the endocrine system in that it releases both glucagon to raise blood sugar, blood glucose levels, and it releases insulin to lower blood sugar or insulin levels if our glucose level is too high. So that's what the pancreas does on the endocrine side of things. The pancreas is also called an exocrine organ. It's part of, and we'll be talking about this later in the semester, the pancreas is part of the digestive system as well and releases chemicals called pancreatic juices into the small intestine that break down our food into their smallest particles so they can be reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. So the pancreas is very unique in that it actually is a critical component of two different body systems. And the same with the gonads. And the gonads are our reproductive endocrine organs, ovaries for females, testicles for males. Of course, on the endocrine side, the hormones that they're releasing for males, for the most part, is testosterone. For females, progesterone and estrogen. Okay, those are the primary hormones released. But of course, ovaries and testicles also have dual functionality when it comes to our reproductive systems, as we'll talk about at the very conclusion of Bio 211 semester. Okay, so that's kind of an overview of the endocrine system organs and a little bit of the layout of what they're all about. Those of you that had me for 210 know I like to go ahead and talk about multiple things when there's an image here for you to be referencing while I'm describing things so that you can picture and correlate it, and hopefully it makes a little bit more sense and resonates and sticks in your memory a little better. I'd much rather do that than go to the next slides and just read text bullet points to you. Okay, so you'll see that I do that throughout the semester. I think it helps students to better remember things when you're looking at the picture while I'm describing what's going on. This next slide is an example of that. This is pretty much what I've just talked about already. What are the endocrine glands? The hypothalamus is the master gland of the endocrine system, etc. Okay, so we've covered all this before. The one unique aspect that we didn't mention is that pituitary gland that sits right underneath the hypothalamus, these two major players in the endocrine system, is separated into both an anterior and a posterior lobe. We'll be talking a lot more about that on Tuesday. We'll also talk about and see slides on that in lab when we meet for the endocrine system next week, Tuesday. So very important to remember, and believe me, you'll remember by the time we're done, that the pituitary has both an anterior and posterior lobe, and they do very, very different things, as we'll learn next week. Then we talked about, of course, the pancreas and the gonads having double duty, and we talked about the thymus being a pretty unique gland, and that the fact that it's really only active during infancy, childhood, and the beginning of puberty. All right, so that takes us to our first interactive quiz question. And remember, we don't put these in the chat. You just write them down for yourself, and then within 15 minutes of lecture ending, you'll drop them to me in an email. And I will go ahead and send you an email back saying extra credit earned, like I did last time. You guys did an excellent job with that when we met on Tuesday. So this first quiz question. So what are the chemical substances secreted into the bloodstream that regulate or cause a cells and metabolic activity to kick into gear? Are they enzymes? Are they antibodies? Or are they hormones? These are the chemicals that are dumped into the bloodstream to cause a metabolic reaction at the cells.
Hormones.
Okay, we'll write those down for yourselves. Everybody make sure that you have your microphones muted, please. Unless you have a question, of course. All right, and we're continuing. All right, so the bulk of the last of our time today is going to be spent on kind of the loop, the process of an endocrine organ being stimulated, that there's a change in homeostasis, a disruption, something's wrong. And then the 5 action steps that occur. And we'll break down each one of these and look at what occurs. It's actually kind of a common sense and easy to follow flow chart at the end of the day. But we're going to go through them one by one. I like to, at this point, remind that the endocrine system works on what is called a negative feedback loop. And if you remember, in Bio 210, we talked about feedback loops and negative feedback loops in particular, right? And a negative feedback loop, my analogy that I use to teach what that is the illustration of your thermostat in your house, okay? If your thermostat is set at 70 degrees, okay, that means 70 degrees above is homeostasis, if you will, in your house. The furnace isn't going to kick on. Everything is quote unquote normal. But if we have a cold day like today and cold air is drifting in and you get down to 69, 68 degrees, that thermostat is going to sense all of a sudden it's out of homeostasis. Something is wrong. We need a correction. So that would be the stimulus that an endocrine organ receives. It's a signal from somewhere in the body, any type of a receptor saying there's a problem. It could be that the pH of your blood has changed. It could be that there's too little or too much calcium in your bloodstream. It could be tissue repair is needed. Mitosis needs to kick into gear. There's some type of stimuli that starts the process. All right. Then your thermostat is going to send a signal to your furnace, right? Saying we need to warm up. There's a problem. The endocrine gland is going to do the same thing. And that's going to secrete that hormone, a hormone that is specific to, related to what the problem is, into the bloodstream. So it can head toward the cells that can make the correction. Okay. The blood is going to transport the hormone to the target cells. Okay. And in this case, the analogy of your thermostat is that signal is going to go to your furnace, and the furnace is going to start a fire there, and it's going to produce heat, right? And that heat is going to come back through the ducts and warm the house back up, right? And then that negative feedback loop, once that temperature rises back up to 70, that initial stimuli will be eliminated. Homeostasis has been restored, and the furnace will turn off. That's that negative feedback loop. Okay. With hormones, the hormone's going to bind to a very specific receptor, again, like a lock and a key, at a cell or an organ or a tissue type that's capable of making the correction that the stimulus needs. And that's going to create the change. And then once that change has been made, the hormone and the endocrine organs will stop secreting those hormones, and everything goes back to idle, just like your furnace and your heating system in your house would once the temperature's been restored. Okay, so that's kind of an analogy to real life things of how the endocrine organs work based on some type of a disruption of normal, the stages, and then turning themselves back off, stopping to release hormones once homeostasis has been restored or the correction has been made. All right, so there's three different types of stimuli that the endocrine organs can receive. And this is step one in a little bit more detail. And I mentioned the first two already, the nervous system and the hormone, the endocrine organs releasing hormones into the bloodstream. The third is humoral, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And it's a lesser player as well. The vast majority are going to be endocrine organs dumping hormones into the bloodstream. Okay, neural we talked about already, right? The brain processing some type of stimuli, sending a signal, for example, fight or flight in a panic type situation, sending an electrical response to the adrenal medulla to release norepinephrine and epinephrine, causing protective actions of the body to try to survive and protect the perceived or real threat. So that's the nervous system. Again, short-lived, specific, intense. Hormonal, we've talked about, and all of Tuesday, we're going to talk about hormone stimuli. Okay, this is the endocrine organs dumping hormones into the blood to go out and make some type of a correction to homeostasis, some type of a disruption that's occurred. And then humoral, whenever we hear the term humoral, we're talking about the systemic throughout our body and in our blood. Okay, and in this case, it's different than hormones circulating in our blood in that the receptors are actually in our blood vessels. Okay, so we have receptors, and we'll talk more about this when we go through cardiovascular system and talk about blood vessels. But there are receptors in our arteries that can detect things like blood sugar, calcium levels, blood pressure, fluid levels in our blood. All of those things are all signaled to receptors that are embedded in the walls of our arteries that can send, if there's a disruption, for example, too much or too little calcium content in our bloodstream, those receptors will send a signal to our brain, which will send a signal to our hypothalamus to signal the anterior pituitary gland, which will signal the parathyroid glands to release calcium and calcitonin, the hormone to elevate calcium levels. Okay, so that's all humoral is. Again, it's a lesser player like neural, but there's three different types of stimuli that are possible. All right, step two. So now we've received the stimuli. The endocrine gland has detected and sensed that there's a problem from whatever source it may be, neural, humoral, or hormonal. Okay, now the next stage is, like I just described, the endocrine gland is going to respond by secreting some type of a hormone into the bloodstream. Okay, so hormones, again, are chemical messengers that circulate. Okay, again, like I described to you previously, they're regulated by negative feedback in that a disruption of homeostasis will flip the light switch on in the endocrine organ and activate it to start releasing a hormone to make that fix or repair. And then once it's repaired, the negative feedback loop will switch the light switch or switch that endocrine organ off, and it will stop releasing that hormone because the problem has been fixed. Okay, now hormones are different than what we call local chemical messengers. Local chemical messengers are also hormones, but they don't go out into the bloodstream like the name says, and we can see on this next slide. They only work a short distance, generally within an organ, okay? Like within the pancreas. The pancreas may send a signal to another part of the pancreas to do something. Okay, that's a local chemical messenger. It's still a chemical, it's released, but it's within the organ. Hormones in the endocrine system dump the messengers into the entire bloodstream and they circulate the whole body. So that's the key difference between the two. All right, step three. Now the hormone has been dumped into the blood. Obviously, now we have to transport it via the blood to the site of the receptor. the site of the organ, the tissue where those receptors, those very specific receptors exist. So an action can occur, a correction can occur, okay? And here's where we're going to break this down into the first two broad-based categories of hormones, okay? Because that's very important to how they're transported in our circulatory system within our blood, okay? The two types of hormones there are water-soluble hormones and there are fat-soluble hormones, lipid-soluble, okay? And remember that water and fat, lipids, repel each other, okay? They are opposites of one another, okay? So something that's water soluble, an example would be if I had a glass jar full of water and I dumped 2 teaspoons of sugar into that glass jar. That sugar is instantaneously going to dissolve, right? So that's water soluble. It means it can dissolve. It's very compatible with water and it's going to dissolve very easily. Okay. Now, the reason that's important is because remember what we learned about blood in lab, that about 60% of blood is plasma, the liquid portion of blood. The other 40 are those formed elements, the erythrocytes, the leukocytes, and the platelets, right? So if 60% of blood is plasma, the liquid portion, 80% of that plasma is water. Okay, so that's why hormones that are water soluble, when they hit blood, easily just blend right in and can be carried without any issue whatsoever in blood. Okay, they're very, very compatible. All right, now the fat soluble hormones, though, are something very, very different. We'll talk about those in a minute. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the water soluble, and I'll just follow up on what I just showed. These are generally proteins. These are the vast majority of hormones in the endocrine system are water soluble hormones. They're generally protein amino acid structures. Okay, these are the water soluble variety. And again, the vast majority of hormones are water soluble. And again, they quickly and easily dissolve in plasma and are easily transported. But the lipid and fat soluble hormones have a problem. Because remember what I said, that lipids and water are opposites. They reject each other. They repel each other. We all know that. Anyone who's had a cheeseburger or a steak for dinner in the evening and they leave the plate, maybe sitting in the kitchen sink overnight, going to wash the dishes in the morning. You'll wake up and you'll see that congealed fat in the morning. It's almost like a yellowish gel, right? That's that lipid, the fat that is congealed. And when you go to wash that plate, you try to rinse it off with water, what happens? That water runs right off the top, right? You have to physically scrub to get that fat off the plate. That's because the lipids, that fat, repels water. It sheds it off. Okay. And that's honestly why wax on your car works. Okay. When you wax your car, you're putting a coat of fat on your car. And when rainwater then hits that car hood, it immediately beads and runs off because that fat in the wax is repelling the water. That's how car wax works as well. Okay, so as a result, as we can see, and from what I just described, fats don't dissolve in water. So lipid soluble hormones can't dissolve the way water soluble can. So they can't dissolve in the plasma. So they couldn't be transported. However, there is a mechanism that can, and these are called transport proteins. These are protein fragments that are floating around in our plasma that fat soluble hormones can bind to, they can attach themselves to and be carried throughout the bloodstream, kind of like hopping into an Uber to go somewhere. Okay, so water soluble hormones dissolve right into the water of the plasma and are easily transported throughout the body. Lipid soluble hormones need to find a plasma bound protein, attach themselves, and then they can be carried through the body. big difference and distinction between the two broad categories of hormones, lipid soluble versus water soluble. All right, so now we have the hormones have been transported, regardless of what type they are. Okay, and like I said previously, and you can see that this is underlined, so it's going to be important for your exam. Hormones, remember, only interact with, only influence cells that have very specific receptors for that hormone. Okay, again, my analogy and the one I encourage you to think of is like a lock and a key. If you took your car keys out into the school parking lot, right? There could be 75 cars parked in the parking lot, but your key is only going to work for one lock, and that's your car. That's how hormones are. So if glucagon is floating around the hormone, it's only going to react with cells, tissues, and organs that have glucagon receptors. So that's why, despite hormones traveling systemically throughout the entire bloodstream, we only get an appropriate reaction because there aren't receptors on other organs that it can bind to and activate. Okay? So that receptor again is like the lock. Okay? Now, just like transporting lipid soluble and water soluble hormones, there's a key difference as to where these receptors are located in the cells of the target organs or organ systems. Okay, we're going to spend the next couple of slides talking about that, and it's going to be really important, and it's going to be on the test. All right, so you can see this slide is basically the entire thing. You're going to need to know the process called direct gene activation, and it looks like a lot, but it's really not. It's kind of common sense, and after I explain it, it's going to make a lot of sense. All right, so now we're talking specifically about those lipid-soluble hormones, the ones that had to bind to a plasma protein to move around the vascular system to begin with. Okay, so when a lipid-soluble hormone, a steroid, arrives at a cell where it's intended to be, and it's looking for its receptor, the lipid-soluble hormone can pass right through the plasma membrane without any issue whatsoever. Okay, and that's because back to Bio 210, we learned about the organelles and parts of a cell. Remember what a plasma membrane is composed of? It's a double lipid, phospholipid bilayer. So the plasma membrane is made of lipids, fats. Okay, so because the plasma membrane, which is responsible for acting like a guard shack and letting only, remember they're semi-permeable, they only let select things into the cell and select things out of a cell, okay? The lipid-soluble steroid can pass right through the lipid plasma membrane, like as if you drove up to Fort Jackson and the gate, the arm to the guard shack is open. They just pass right on through unchecked, no issue whatsoever. So because that lipid-soluble steroid type hormone can pass right through the plasma membrane, its receptors are found in the cytosol. Okay, and the cytosol is that gel-like substance inside of the cell that holds all the organelles and gives the cell its shape. Okay, it holds all the things like the nucleus and the mitochondria and the ribosomes, all those parts, right? Okay, so again, because these type of hormones can go right through the plasma membrane, the receptors are inside the cell in the cytosol. All right, so next, what occurs then? So far we have the lipid-soluble hormone arriving at the cell. It passes without any effort right through the plasma membrane to the receptor, which is in the cytosol. Once that receptor and the hormone bind together, it's called a receptor hormone complex, because what it's done is that hormone has activated, it's turned on that receptor. It's now, the receptor was sitting there inactive, waiting until the hormone matched up with it, again, like a lock and key. Okay, once that receptor has contact with the hormone, and it's now a complex, it's active, it's going to head toward the nucleus of the cell. Into the nucleus, it's going to locate a very specific section on our DNA. It's very specific to whatever instructions, whatever coding are related to the disruption of homeostasis is occurring. Okay, that receptor hormone is going to bind to the DNA, which is going to activate a gene, which in this example is going to initiate a protein synthesis, the creation of a protein. Okay, let's say there's some tissue damage. Okay, now this gene activation could do any number of things. It could release enzymes, it could release other chemicals, it could release other hormones, but this is just one example, is protein synthesis. But remember, the receptor hormone complex, once they bind together, enters the nucleus, finds the area on the DNA that it needs for the specific fix that's required, and then it's going to activate some type of a response. Okay, and then that entire, well, the new protein is going to cause a change in the target. It's going to create a new protein in this case, and that whole process is called direct gene activation. That's the title for all of this. Okay, so that's a lipid-soluble hormone, from release of an endocrine gland, binding to a plasma protein, freely making it through the plasma membrane, mating up with a receptor in the cytosol, now activating that receptor, heading into the nucleus, locating the section of DNA that codes to activate a specific gene. That new gene is going to cause a change. It's going to create something. And that whole process is called direct gene activation. All right, here's an illustration of exactly what I just showed you guys. Okay, here's that steroid hormone going to pass through the plasma membrane without incident. Here's that receptor in the cytosol waiting for it. They've now bound together and activated that receptor. Now it's a receptor hormone complex. Now it moves into the nucleus, binds to the DNA, starts creating and altering genes to create a new protein. Okay, just an illustrated version of what we had on the previous slide. All right, so let's go to the second quiz question first. So, what is the ability of a specific tissue, cell, or organ type when it responds to the presence of a hormone? What does it require? Okay, it's dependent on what? What does a hormone need to activate some type of a response from a cell or an organ? Does it need the presence of appropriate receptors? Does it need nothing because all hormones can stimulate all cell types? Or is the resting membrane potential of the cells, what allows an action response?
A. The presence of the appropriate receptors.
Okay, remember, we're just writing these down. We're not going to share them. We're just going to write them down and then email them in at the end of class for extra credit. Okay? But thank you. And you're absolutely correct. You're absolutely correct. No problem at all.
Sorry about that.
Not a problem. Not even slightly a problem. It's early in the course. Believe me, if this is the worst problem we have early in the course, this is going to be a great course. So no problems. All right. So that was the lipid-soluble type. Now let's talk about the water-soluble type. All right. So how do they get into the cell and create the response, some type of a reaction? Okay. So the problem is, as you guys can probably anticipate, remember, water-soluble hormones had it easier as far as transportation. They got dumped right into the plasma and are easily transported. However, when they get to the plasma membrane, remember, once again, that plasma membrane is a double phospholipid bilayer. It's made of fat. And what does fat do to water? It repels it. So when the water-soluble hormones arrive at the gate, at the plasma membrane, the plasma membrane rejects it and won't let it in. Now that arm at the gate guard shack at Fort Jackson is down, and it's saying, you can't come in here. Okay, so in order to accommodate for that, the receptors for water soluble aren't inside the cell in the cytosol. They instead are embedded in the plasma membrane itself. Okay, so that way the receptors and the hormones can still bond. Okay, and from there, we're going to go through a series of reactions that's called a secondary messenger system or second messenger system. And it's really just a chain reaction. Okay, and we're going to spend the next couple of slides talking about that secondary messenger system. Okay, the easiest way to think of a secondary messenger system is I always use the analogy of a relay race at a track and field event. Okay, when you have a relay race, you may have, for example, 4 different runners out on the track at various locations, right? And when the starting gun goes off, the first relay runner on the team grabs the baton and starts running to where the second relay runner is waiting. And then he or she hands off that baton, and the person, that first runner, is now done, but the second runner now is activated. And he or she runs to the third runner, and the cycle repeats itself. Okay, that's exactly what occurs in the second messenger system for passing on the message, the intelligence, the signal from an endocrine hormone to make its way into the DNA inside the nucleus and affect some type of a change. Remember, the hormone can't get past the plasma membrane, so we have to get that message inside to the nucleus in a different manner. And it's this chain reaction system called secondary messenger. Okay, so here's what happens. Here's the hormone in these pink bubbles in the bloodstream, arrives at the cell. It hits this phospholipid plasma membrane and is rejected entry. So it binds here in purple is the receptor that's embedded in the plasma membrane for water soluble hormones so that they can still work and be effective. All right, so the hormone, when it binds to the receptor, then activates what's called a G protein. And it's a little protein fragment right inside of the plasma membrane, here illustrated in blue. That G protein then goes over to an enzyme and activates the enzyme. Now remember, an enzyme chemically is something that promotes or encourages an action, a chemical reaction, okay? So that enzyme now has been activated, and it's going to activate another chemical inside the cell called a secondary messenger. And all of these names change depending on what type of a response it is, but just understand the basic stages of it. This secondary messenger is much like the receptor was with lipid-soluble hormones. It's been sitting inactive until the enzyme activates it. It now takes the message and heads in toward the nucleus to the DNA, and the rest is the exact same process. Okay? So you have the hormone, the water-soluble hormone, arriving at the cell, rejected from the plasma membrane because it's lipid in nature. So it binds to the receptor embedded in the plasma membrane wall. The receptor, in a chain reaction fashion, activates the G protein, which activates an enzyme, which activates a secondary messenger. In this case, in this illustration, it's cyclic AMP, which is then going to carry the exact coding that this hormone had, like a messenger, into the DNA in the nucleus, and the response will occur. Okay? All right, and then this is another illustration of where I've embedded a table here for you for study purposes, comparing lipid-soluble hormones to water-soluble hormones. Again, just for studying to refresh your memory a few weeks from now when you're looking at this, preparing for the test. All right, and then the last of the 5 steps, of course, we have to have a change, right? That's what all of this was about. There was a stimuli, that there was a disruption to homeostasis, And all of this was to effect and create some type of a change to restore things to normal. Okay. And these are just several examples of changes that a target cell can produce as a result of a hormone being released. Okay. For example, we can change the membrane permeability of a cell to allow more or less potassium or sodium, for example, in. It can make more permeable or less, depending on what the disruption of homeostasis is. It can stimulate the synthesis of either enzymes or proteins. Okay, it can activate or deactivate enzymes. It can cause secretions to occur depending on the organ and again what the disruption of homeostasis is. And then it can also stimulate in the event of growth or tissue injury or trauma. It can stimulate mitosis. Okay, so these are just some examples of what are the hormones actually doing at the end of the day. All right, then to kind of wrap up for today. All right, so we've talked a lot about the receptors, right? And how they're like the lock and the hormones are like the key. All right, so the amount of receptors on our cells can vary. It can increase, called upregulation, or it can decrease, called downregulation. And what makes it more receptors or less receptors is the amount of the hormone in the blood to begin with. Okay, so you can see this is underlined that if you have a very low amount of a hormone circulating in the bloodstream, okay, like a very low amount of calcium, for example, the arterial receptors are going to sense that and they're going to signal for more calcium type binding receptors to be engaged so that they have a better chance of catching calcium because there's very little of it in the bloodstream. And then the exact opposite is downregulation. That's when there's an abundance of a hormone. Here we have a lot of calcium. So we don't need as many receptors, right? It's like if you had a net and there's fish. If there's 1,000 fish in a tank and you have a net, you only need one small net and you're probably going to be able to catch some fish. But if there's only one fish and it's a 50-gallon tank, you're probably going to need a bigger net or more nets in order to catch it. Okay, so it's directly related to the amount of the hormone circulating in the blood. The body reacts by making either more or less receptors, so it's ready when it's needed. All right, that's it for today, guys. We're going to pick up with the hypothalamus gland, like I said, a major player, and we're going to work through each of the endocrine organs. Next Tuesday is a really important day for you guys to be here. Don't miss Tuesday because we go over a lot of heavy lifting on these organs, specifically on the hormones that they release, the signaling hormones, the categories of hormones that they're called. So there's a good amount of content on Tuesday that's going to be on your exam. Really tough to teach yourself that stuff. So just fair warning, be here on Tuesday, okay? Enjoy. We have a 3-day weekend for most of us, a 4-day weekend if you have Friday off also. Remember, no school on Monday, student holiday for MLK, terrific break early on in the semester. Any questions on today's content?
I have a question.
Yes.
The questions that we have to turn in, those are just for extra credit.
They're for extra credit and to prove that you were here. That's the way I take attendance in remote classes. They have to be submitted to me via an email within 15 minutes of the lecture ending, because what we run into sometimes with remote classes is people will sign up for a remote class and they'll just record the lecture and they'll go back to bed, or they'll be working or something of that nature, and that's not attending the class. So that's why we embed these questions and you have to submit them within 15 minutes in order to prove that you were actively engaged in part of the lecture.
Okay, I didn't never submit one yesterday, but I was in class. Not yesterday, I'm sorry.
I mentioned it multiple times, so you're going to have to pay a lot closer attention because I must have mentioned it at least 5, if not 6 or 8 times. So make sure you're paying attention because that's the only way I can show that you were here. Okay?
Okay, so that's an absent for.
Yeah, that was an absent. That was an absence for there, but don't worry. It's early in the semester, and I'm not worried about it. Just make sure to just jump on board from here on. Not a problem at all. Nothing to worry about. Any other questions?
Okay, on the answers, you just want us to put the letters?
That's all you have to put.
Okay.
Yep, you can just drop me an email with BA or whatever the answer is. That's all you need to do because I have your email address, which gives me your name. And then I'll respond that you received your extra credit.
All right, thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, don't bother taking the time to type out the answers.
Okay, on Tuesday, I thought I sent mine, but it still says in draft. But I sent mine today. But I was here for my whole class on Tuesday.
Okay, I think I have yours. I think I only had one absent on Tuesday. So yeah, let me look here. VO2. Evans, nope, I have you as absent because I didn't receive it. So
Yeah.
that's the only way I can prove it. So I can't take I was here. I have to get the email within 15 minutes.
Well, I just sent my other email, but I thought my email went through, so I'm not gonna send it. But I was here my whole class.
Okay, yeah, just again, it's not a big deal by any means. This is early in the course. These things happen.
I just don't like no absence on my stuff when I'm here, so that's the reason why I was reaching out. I don't like no absence on my attendance.
I understand. Just make sure that your email goes through that going forward. We won't have any problem. Okay. Yeah, just make sure it goes through.
All right.
All right. Any other questions before we break?
Yes, I was gonna ask really quickly if you were able to enable Respondus lockdown and webcam for the iPad.
Yes, I already have.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Already done. Yep, starting this semester, we've been told we can do it. It used to be a school policy that we didn't. Now we do.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
What active quiz question or what we supposed to be emailing? Because I'm kind of lost.
Okay. All right. There's several of you that really need to start listening. Okay. If you hope to pass this class, because that was explained again, like many other things, multiple times. The extra credit / attendance verification questions are embedded in the lecture. And we had 2 of them today, and they have to be submitted within 15 minutes of the lecture ending via email to me to prove that you were here actively listening throughout my lecture, not out in another room or watching TV or on your phone or out in the yard. Okay, so that's what happens, and that's how you do it. You answer those questions and you send them to me in an email at the end of the lecture.
I had a question. Is there
Yes.
any way I emailed you the questions and stuff already? Is there
Yes.
any way to get the PowerPoint like outside of this class
Yes.
time?
Yeah, of course.
Where is it in D2L? Is it in like the
under contact?
Under slides, it's
Is it like under the module, like where it says like the endocrine system?
the read, what is it called?
Yes. Go into the module for this chapter, for example, and you'll see the presentation is there. It's underlined, and you click on it, and then there'll be that entire
under read
presentation.
and review.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. That's what it's there for, because those you guys are going to need to study from. You know, you're going to study from those presentations. That's where you find them. All right, guys. Well, have an absolutely outstanding long weekend, despite it being cold. Don't forget, drop me those extra credit questions / answers, and I will see you guys next Tuesday.
Thank
Have
you.
a good day.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Have a nice one.
Thank you, sir.
Bye now.
Thank you. Bye bye.